Hi Year 12. So in today's lesson we finished off going through the Duke of Somerset, and we also started looking at the Duke of Northumberland. We didn't get very far with the Duke of Northumberland though. We've only managed to get a fact file done so far. Today's lesson is mostly going to be completing all the important detailed notes about his time leading in Edward's government, and also you're going to need to do some comprehension work on succession and things like that, which are also quite important when looking at Northumberland's time in leadership. So I've just put this title on the screen for you in case you'd like to write it down again, but just feel free to carry on under last lesson's work because it's the same title that we actually wrote down in lesson today. So how effective was government under the Duke of Northumberland? If you've already got that down and you're happy to move on, then of course you can get started with the lesson now. Right guys, now this is a bit of a recap, but I would still like you to make notes from this because I hope that after going through these key points here, it will really help you to see how Northumberland comes to power and how Somerset falls from power. So first of all, it's important that we have a think about how did Somerset fall from power? What was Northumberland's involvement? So if you want to take a look back at your notes for this, have a little flick through and think, right, why did Somerset fall from power? How did that happen? So you should have made notes last lesson on the actual steps and how it happened. But I'd like to really shorten this down for you and make it quite memorable. So here's some of the points that I think are really important for you to know. How did Somerset fall from power and how does Northumberland come into power? So if you want to make notes on these 4 bullet points, feel free to shorten them down. But of course, each one is still important. I'll take you through them and maybe expand on some things if I need to. So in terms of how he came to power, I think it's important we mention the events of 1549. Now remember the events of 1549 are particularly about the rebellions, the riots, the uprising against particularly the religious changes of Somerset, because they were quite cautious and people didn't really know where they stood. But also there were a lot of issues in the economy as well, and people were standing up to things like enclosures. We know that he tried to help with that, but it was very much a situation that led to just grievances on both sides. The poor people felt that actually they just got their hopes up, and the rich people, the landowners, they felt very agitated that Somerset had been involving himself in their business. So he basically upset everybody in that, and nothing was really achieved. But the events of 1549 gave Northumberland the opportunity, to take advantage of Somerset's political isolation. So what that means is that Somerset, as we know, had become very unpopular, particularly reasons due to the fact that he was quite arrogant, he'd named himself the Protector, he tried to take control of the king, and a lot of people were quite agitated by this. Also, a lot of the decisions he'd made hadn't been ruthless enough. I suppose he'd been too cautious in things. And again, that had led to a lot of confusion, which people were unhappy with. He was trying to please everybody, but in the end, kind of pleased nobody. And that did lead to him being politically isolated. And so at that point, Northumberland becomes a major rival for power. Now, you might be thinking, well, why Northumberland out of all of the men? But Northumberland was a man of power already. Okay, he was somebody with an army. If you remember, he was incredibly important in bringing down the Ketz Rebellion. We are going to study the Ketz Rebellion in a lot more detail in a couple of lessons when we look at society. But it's important that you remember the last lesson we did mention that the Ketz Rebellion was put down by Northumberland, and therefore he appeared to be the greater leader, and therefore he was a major rival for power. Northumberland then was, I suppose, quite, again, devious, really, in the way he brought Somerset down from power, because Northumberland pretended to be a Catholic sympathiser. He wasn't actually, okay, he was a very strong Protestant, but he pretended to be a Catholic sympathiser, and that basically meant that he then conspired with the Catholics, or the conservative people on the council, to remove Somerset from power. So he conspired with the Catholic or conservative people there, even though he wasn't part of that group. He worked with them, successfully bringing Somerset down from power. This then gave him control of the council with the help of the Catholic sympathisers, but then he turns his back on them. Look at this next point. The Conservatives, like the Earls of Arundel and the Earl of Southampton, were secretly planning to seize power, so they obviously didn't trust him either. But then they wanted to have him arrested along with Somerset, but he'd already been plotting against them. So they didn't know that although they turned their back on him, he'd also turned his back on them. And he was plotting along with the reformists on the council to get rid of the Catholics, to get rid of the conservative people on the council. And so he'd been planning particularly with Archbishop Cranmer, because he was a strong Protestant too. And this person had influence over the royal household, and it quickly gained Northumberland access to the king. Now remember that the king himself, Edward, was a strong Protestant. It would have been much more easy for him to get to the king's ear if he was also along the same lines of religion. And this placed him in a really strong position to expel the Conservatives from the council, and instead made himself the Lord President of the council. So he gives himself a more popular title, but also he's removed his opposition, hasn't he? So not only has he stripped the power from Somerset, but then he's also crept into power by manipulating the Catholic sympathisers and the Conservatives on the council. And then he's also kind of taken the power for himself by making himself Lord President and, I suppose, getting the king's ear very securely. We'll talk a bit more about how he does that in the government section. But if you could just make some notes on those 4 points there so it's clear in your books, how did Northumberland get into power? What steps did he take? Right guys, this next task we're going to do our main note making task for this lesson. So how effective was government under the Duke of Northumberland? Could you put that as your first big subheading please? And then after that you're going to use the 4 subheadings that are placed on the slide. You can see government administration, Crown's finances, foreign policy and religious changes. Now you're going to make your notes using the additional reading I put on Show My Homework, which is called Northumberland Rule Info. And once you've finished making your notes under these subheadings, and I would like you to be quite detailed with your notes, I would then like you to assess how effective was the government under the Duke of Northumberland. I'd like to explain why. So do you think he was generally a very successful leader with Edward? And I would like to include all 4 sections. I know it says government and that might lead you to think just the first section, but actually governing the country includes all 4 sections. So if you can make sure you refer to all of them. You may want to decide which one of those areas he was more successful in. Maybe there was one area that he's more successful than the others. You can mention that within your conclusion, but I would like to make sure that once you've finished your notes, you must explain how effective he was. Now, this part is quite important to me, so if you would like to send your conclusion, please do send it. I would like to hear opinions on this. So if you want to send that over, I'd be very happy to read that. But if I'm going to leave you with that for now, guys, because that's mostly something you need to get on with. Read the sheet very, very carefully, make your notes as detailed as you can, and explain your answer in relation to the question I've put in the corner there. Before moving on to the next slide, you must make sure you complete that first. Right, so for the next part of the lesson, we're going to finish by looking at the problems of Edward's succession. Now, what I mean by that is that Edward didn't just become king very young, but he also died young too. He was dead before he was the age of 16, and he died childless, and therefore, when it came to succession, there was a real problem. Now, many of you will remember that under Henry, there had been acts of succession passed that basically led to Mary and Elizabeth both being declared illegitimate. But in 1544, both of them were named legitimate once more. But, of course, they were never expected to rule because it was hoped that Edward would have children. One of the major problems with succession was that Mary, of course, was a Catholic. She was the eldest of the 2 sisters and therefore would likely be next to rule. That is something that Edward and Northumberland had a real problem with. They did not want to see the changes that they'd made as Protestant rulers be completely reversed by the rule of Mary. So what that then meant is that they set up this plan, and it's called the Device Plan. Now, I'd like you to look into what that plan was, why they wanted it, and whether or not it worked, whether it was illegal, and why, obviously, it was quite a surprising thing to have created. Now, you'll be able to answer these comprehension questions using page 129 in your textbook. So you don't need any other information. Just go to page 129, and then I'd like you to answer these questions in full using detail from the textbook. And once you've completed that, we can then finish the lesson by talking over these points on the next slide. Okay, so we're now going to go over your notes, guys, for the problems of succession, and particularly talk about Lady Jane Grey and what this all became. So in terms of the problems with succession, as we know, Edward was on his deathbed by February 1553, and by March it was quite clear that he was dying. Okay, so he had quite a quick death. He'd always been quite a sickly child, but generally in these last few months of his life, he was at a point where he was clearly not going to make it much longer. People had always assumed he would at least make it to adulthood, but this new illness basically meant that people now realised that he was going to die childless and that this would lead to an issue with succession. Now, the reason, of course, it leads to an issue with succession is because it was obvious from Henry's will that if Edward was to die childless, that Mary would become the next Queen of England. But this was an issue because obviously Edward and Northumberland were very enthusiastic about making sure that Protestantism remained. They'd made many significant religious changes under Northumberland, as you'll have made some notes on in the previous task. This would have all been ruined. You know, Edward and Northumberland had finally made those massive changes that Henry hadn't done, that Somerset hadn't done, and now the country was moving towards becoming more Protestant. Yes, the people weren't really Protestant, but the structure, I suppose you could say that the government was leading from a more Protestant approach, and that was clear. So for the first time, the Reformation is actually really starting to take place. And now that was all going to be reversed if Mary became queen. So it was really important to both Edward and Northumberland that that did not happen. And so they decided to come up with the plan, the device, which essentially was going to alter the succession. So it was going to alter Henry's will. And that was something that a lot of people would have been very upset about. And actually, the original idea may well have come from Edward, but some at the time said it was his nasty advisor, Northumberland, that had made him come up with this plan. But actually, a lot of people believe now that Edward was very much involved in this and that he wanted to continue Protestantism and did not want to see the reversal of many of the policies he felt strongly about. And as far as, you know, Edward saw it, yes, Elizabeth and Mary were his sisters, but actually, in some ways, he saw them as illegitimate. You know, both of them had been made illegitimate by law, and it was only reversed in 1544. But even at that point, it wasn't ever expected that either of these people would rule. Edward didn't see his sisters as likely successors to his rule. He felt that actually he should be able to pick somebody that was much more suited to rule after him. Now, of course, Edward didn't really have anybody else in mind. To be honest, there were no strong male suitors out there for the throne. So in that sense, you could say that there was a pool of females, which was, you know, never considered a popular choice at the time. But the person that was considered a better option than Mary or Elizabeth was Lady Jane Grey. Now, Lady Jane Grey was partly chosen because of her links with Northumberland. Now, you'll have read within your in the textbook when you were just making your notes just now that Jane was actually married to Northumberland's son. Now, basically, that meant that if Northumberland wanted to maintain power, this was the perfect choice. Because if Lady Jane Grey became the new queen, Northumberland would maintain his control over her, and his son would also maintain control over her. As a woman with no real political understanding, she would have never been left to her own devices. She would have just been, I suppose, chosen because she was a cousin to the monarch. In terms of the way that they were going to go about getting Lady Jane Grey on the throne, they went about, first of all, by declaring, and when I say they, I mean Edward and Northumberland, they went about declaring Elizabeth and Mary as illegitimate, and they started to make preparations to call Parliament to ratify this new treaty and say, actually, you know, both of these sisters are not going to rule. They cannot. They are illegitimate. Henry himself had said so previously. But Edward had died before Parliament could be called. And so one of the only reasons why this plan didn't get carried through was because Edward didn't make it to see it through. And essentially, without Parliament sanctioning this device, it was illegal, okay? So it couldn't be carried through. The legal will of Henry VIII had stated that Mary was going to be the next queen. And a lot of English people felt very strongly about that. They felt very strongly that that was the right thing to do, that she was the legitimate ruler chosen by Henry VIII himself. And so there was no way they were just going to accept Lady Jane Grey without some sort of legal documentation. Now, essentially, after this point, Northumberland didn't really seem to have any other plans of action. So it seems that actually, once the king died, he didn't really know what to do, because his plan was to get this passed through Parliament before the king's death. But then, because the king died so suddenly and they couldn't carry on with the device, they couldn't carry on with the plan that they had, it meant that he then just declared Lady Jane Grey as queen without any real legal standing on that. When we begin to look at the rule of Mary, and when we look at how Mary became queen, you'll find out a lot more about how she gets back into power and how she gets rid of this issue of Lady Jane Grey. But what I did want to mention is that if you know anything about Lady Jane Grey, you'll probably know one of the things is that her reign lasted 9 days. She's known as the 9-day queen. Now, that's obviously because she was executed, but not after 9 days. I don't want you to be under any assumption that Mary had her executed straight away, because she didn't, okay? Lady Jane Grey was actually 16 years old when this all happened to her. Now, Lady Jane Grey also did not want a position of power. She had no ambitions to become queen. She was essentially guided into this position by ambitious men like her husband and her father-in-law. They were the people behind this. She was a 16-year-old girl that was kind of dragged into it because she had some sort of claim to the throne, and she was a Protestant. And of course, it would mean that Northumberland would maintain its power. And so this person was being, I suppose, ruled by some of the most ambitious men at court, and she didn't really have a choice. So when we look at this picture right now on the screen, I've asked you, what can you learn about Lady Jane Grey from this picture? How are we supposed to feel? And when do you think this picture was painted? I want you to have a few minutes just to think about that well, not a few minutes, because I'm not going to give you that long before I go through it, but just a few seconds just to go through this. Have a think about those questions. What are we supposed to feel, and what can we learn about her from this picture here? Okay, so one thing you might be saying is, in terms of, let's pick out a few things from this picture here. We can see the executioner standing quite passively at the side. We can see ladies in waiting in the corner crying in distress. And we can also see somebody leading Lady Jane Grey to the tower of which she will be executed. Now, one thing I would say is that this painting was actually created in the 1800s. It shows Lady Jane Grey being executed indoors, but actually she was executed outdoors. So that's not entirely correct. But I would say that the whole image seems very sad. Wouldn't you agree? That it just feels quite like nobody there wants this to happen. And to be honest, Mary herself, when she had Lady Jane Grey executed, didn't necessarily want it to happen at all. Lady Jane Grey was actually arrested by Mary first. She was never executed at the beginning of all this. Northumberland was. As soon as Mary became queen, Northumberland was executed because he had planned all of this. But Lady Jane Grey, as a device in all of this, was actually just imprisoned. However, I won't go into it in too much depth, but later on in Mary's reign, there's another plot that involves Lady Jane Grey. But again, Lady Jane Grey's name is used in it, but she is not involved. She is in the Tower. But because she is a constant figurehead for conspiracy against Mary, Mary decides to have her killed. I suppose a lot like when we looked at Henry VII, and people like Perkin Warbeck just kept becoming a problem, and eventually had to have him executed. Same with the Earl of Warwick. So I suppose she's a similar person in that sense, that her name just keeps getting used as a figurehead for uprising, and so Mary essentially decides to have her executed eventually. So I just wanted to show you that picture as a finishing part for this lesson, just looking at Lady Jane Grey and how she was involved in the device plan. And that concludes our new learning for this week. So I hope you all enjoyed looking into that. What I would like you to do is to make sure that you go over your notes on Northumberland really clearly, as there will be a quiz that you will be expected to complete.